Welcome to Creating Connection within Health and Wellness
with your host, Demi
and Kirsty,
where we connect and share our perspectives and experiences within the health and wellness industry. Welcome back, everyone, to episode 11 of Creating Connection in Health and Wellness. You've got your beautiful host, Kirsty, and myself, Demi, here. And we are so excited to be back with another awesome topic for this episode. This one today is all about caffeine, the precious nectar, or as we like to say, wakey juice. I don't think I've ever called it actually wakey juice before this podcast, but we are really keen to go through this topic with you today. Obviously, Kirsty and I both have our own relationship with caffeine, and we know that many of our listeners are caffeine or coffee drinkers. So it's going to be a really good one today, packed full of knowledge. If you are someone that needs a coffee to get going in the morning, even if you're someone that doesn't particularly drink a lot of coffee, there is going to be some golden nuggets in here for you. So today we're going to start off with what is caffeine and how does it affect our body?
Awesome. No, super excited to come to this episode for you guys. And, starting off with what is caffeine. So caffeine is a nervous system stimulant. It's classified as a psychoactive, so something that I suppose enhances your system in that way. And it's it's naturally found in the fruits, leaves and beans of the coffee plant, cacao plant, and also guarana plants as well. So it can actually also be made synthetically. So within this, we can get it actually from a lot of different sources. And, we're actually going to go later into the products and stuff of what you can actually get this from, so you can have an understanding where caffeine is present. So if it's something that you want to be mindful of, it's something that you can actually start to build awareness around that, because we have some products later that you might not even realize there's caffeine in it. And that's something that's really important to note too, based around whether how much caffeine consumption you want to have or not as well. And we're going to discuss, in terms of how it also affects your body too. So in terms of affecting your body, in terms of this, it acts as a adenosine receptor inhibitor. So essentially in terms of this, adenosine is something that builds up as soon as we wake. So in terms of this, when we wake up in the morning, adenosine is something that builds up the sleep pressure throughout the day, and essentially tells us to go to bed later in the night because it causes us sleepiness.
Yeah. So what caffeine does is it actually blocks that neurotransmitter so that the adenosine isn't actually binding to the receptor. So when it comes to feeling sleepy, you drink caffeine and actually just stops you from feeling tired. So that's one of the ways that it can actually stimulate your nervous system. So that's why when you drink coffee, you feel more alert, you feel more awake, or you drink caffeine, you feel more alert and more awake. Because what it's actually doing is it's stopping adenosine from actually binding to the receptor. So it's an interesting fun fact that I thought was really cool when I was initially learning about coffee. I thought that when you drink caffeine, it just supercharges your system and gives you all this energy, when it actually, what it's doing is just blocking like a neurotransmitter that tells you to go to sleep. So obviously it has some pretty effective, what am I trying to say? It's pretty effective at stopping you from falling asleep. Well, it should be actually. If you're drinking caffeine and going to sleep, that means that you're probably someone that is less responsive to caffeine. You've got such thing as caffeine non-responders. And if you are drinking so much coffee that it's actually not having an effect, it just means that you have built up a tolerance to caffeine too. So interesting thing about caffeine is that it has a half-life of 5 to 6 hours. So this means if you consume 50 milligrams of caffeine, it's likely that you'll still have around 25 milligrams of caffeine in your system 5 hours later. So there are considerations for fast and slow metabolizers of caffeine too. So it does come down to particular liver enzymes, gene expression that can determine how fast or slow you can actually process caffeine through your system. So there are some people that are super sensitive to caffeine, and this would be down to sort of genetics, gene expression, like your liver enzymes, how well your liver can actually process the caffeine in your system as well. So that's something that's really interesting. You've obviously got people that respond differently to caffeine and how long it actually stays in your system too.
Yeah, that's really important to note because, there's always like those rough guidelines, but then people experience things differently. So for myself, I'm quite caffeine sensitive when it comes to these sort of things. Like I'm maximum 2 a day. Otherwise I'm off the walls and I can't sleep and it impacts my sleep. But coming back in terms of, speaking to when you do drink your coffee and whatnot as well, it's something important to note that even if you can fall asleep after drinking a cup of coffee, this can also impact in terms of the sleep quality as well. So whilst, we speak in terms of when we do consume caffeine and we're like, yeah, cool, we can go to bed late at night. And we sleep through the night, right? Whether it's quality sleep or not is something that can be always discussed in terms of that. But when we speak in terms of these sort of things, it's just important to understand that depending on when you do have your caffeine throughout the day can also impact your sleep as well. So fun fact though, actually, just speaking in the topic of adenosine as well, is that when you're speaking in terms of when it's blocking, essentially the tiredness, the sleep, the adenosine building up throughout the day, is that essentially just say we had a coffee at like 8 o'clock in the morning, and then we had another coffee at 12 o'clock because we're starting to feel tired because it's starting to wear off. Essentially what happens is that even if we have a coffee and it blocks the adenosine from building up, so we essentially do not get that connection. Once the caffeine wears off and, leaves and processes through the body, we get hit with all the adenosine that's built up and plus more, whatever is built up throughout that day that we've tried to block. So that's why we can have like those massive caffeine crashes where it's like, I've had 2 coffees today, and then in the afternoon you're just like, it's 5 o'clock and I'm in a slump. I can't do it. So I have my 3rd cup of coffee, which then disrupts my sleep, which then has coffee.
You wake up the next morning, you feel tired. So that's like a really interesting thing to point out, is it doesn't stop the body from producing adenosine, it just stops it from binding to the receptor. So once the adenosine molecule binds to the receptor, that's when it actually has the effect on helping you feel tired. It's a natural process that the body goes through. So the caffeine actually just blocks that receptor. So it doesn't mean you don't have any adenosine built up. It just means that you're not receptive to it. So that's really, really, really cool information. And then it explains why you get that caffeine crash. So obviously, Kirsty, you're quite like sensitive to caffeine. I'm not. So unless I take a break from it, I'm actually not that sensitive to caffeine. I can consume 3 coffees in a day. I do make sure that I don't consume anything after 12 o'clock. However, I do notice I can still sleep, but my quality of sleep is not as good. So I'm usually, just because of considerations around sleep and considerations around what caffeine does to my system, which we're going to go into a little bit more as well, around nutrient absorption and all that sort of stuff, and like even appetite regulation. I cap it at 2 per day, unless it's like there's some reason why I'm like, I need another coffee because I'm cooked. So for the most part, I cap it at 2 per day. But even still, it's not uncommon for me to feel like I need to take a break from caffeine, just because even with 2 coffees a day, it sometimes doesn't even really have that much of an effect on me. So I'm like, I don't drink coffee to necessarily get an energy hit. I drink coffee because I like the taste.
Oh, fascinating.
Yeah. So we're a little bit different there. Whereas like I could easily drink 3 coffees in a day. I don't. But then if I am ever relying on 3 coffees a day, that's when I'm like, time to take a break.
Yeah. And that's important. That's important to note, sort of like that's building the awareness, I suppose, within yourself, sort of like what's your tolerance levels and what's not.
Yeah.
I find it so fascinating because everyone is so different. Like that's coming back to in terms of like how fast our bodies metabolize things, in terms of that. Myself, I'm not sure if we've discussed that in the further episodes, but I used to drink like 10 to 12 coffees a day in my old job.
I think we have,
completely wired me, and I think that's probably why my body is traumatized in terms of that. It's like, no more, please.
We had our threshold. Enough.
Yeah, you've had enough. You pushed the limits way too far, and now it's like you need to just pull back a little bit, and we're not letting you go further again. So that's like objective, but
yeah, 100%.
But it's good. I suppose before we do go on to further more like more further information, I'd be curious to know, because caffeine's one of those things that I feel like is so socially accepted in our society. I mean, every second corner's got a coffee shop. Coffee's the first thing you give your day, you know, in quotation marks, because that's, you know, I'm going to discuss that. We will discuss that shortly in terms of when it's best to have a coffee, or caffeine as per se. But it's everywhere, right? It's prevalent. It's like, you know, you need your caffeine to get through the day and all these things. And I know I definitely had that culture growing up. My parents drink coffee all the time, and it's just the way it is. You know, I'm curious to know for yourself, Demi, when was the first time you were introduced to any sort of caffeine?
So for me, it was probably actually work related. When I got into the workforce, I started working at a coffee shop. So I wasn't drinking coffee then, but I was serving it to people a lot, just like every single day. People would come in, order coffee. So it was very normal. But I actually, back then, I think I was like 15, I didn't like the taste. So I didn't actually start drinking coffee until definitely after high school. It wouldn't have even been in like 18, I think, when I started traveling and working more in coffee shops and making more coffee. Then I was like, oh, actually, no, it's coming back to me. All right. So the very first time I went to Broome, I moved to Broome, got a job in a coffee shop and got a job in a bar. And then I started making coffee more consistently in a place that had quite a good reputation for coffee. So I started drinking it because I was like, well, I need to know what it tastes like and what a good coffee tastes like and what a bad coffee tastes like. That's actually how I started drinking coffee, was moving, traveling, getting a job in a coffee shop. They wanted me to make coffee. I didn't know what it tastes like because I didn't drink it up until then. Okay. So that's why. But then I loved it. And I was like, oh my God, this is so good. And I was like, yeah, give me more. I was 18 years old. Honestly. How about you?
Oh, I was very similar in terms of age, in terms of that, but mine didn't start in a coffee shop. Mine started in high school, I'm pretty sure. I just remember significantly, I had a friend that used to get I remember it so significantly because I was like, this is where it started. And I was like, oh, yeah. But it's a positive thing too. But they always it was like a quarter strength latte or something with shots of caramel syrup. She's like, yeah, it's so good. Coffee's so good. And I'm like, I realized people always start off with the transition of all of these things and stuff like that. And I'm pretty sure that's how I was introduced to it. And I eventually was she was like, yeah, you got to try it. You got to try it. I was like, okay. And then, I suppose that's the pinnacle of life, right? We're always recommending things to others, and that's how you get roped into things. But, but I'm pretty sure it's how it started. And then eventually went to, it's a full strength one. And then now I'm just I only drink espresso or short black if I have that, or long black. So I'm interesting, but I'm pretty sure that's when it started, but very young. And, I look back at it now and I'm like, geez, I was probably 16 years old or something like that. I didn't need that.
Yeah. You're like, school's not that hard. I don't need that.
No, but I suppose that's always when we're learning and experimenting in terms of things like that. Yeah. But that's sort of when it started, I suppose. And it's always curious because, obviously for both of us, even just discussing that, having some sort of caffeine has been part of our life pretty much ever since it sort of started. But when you think about that in retrospect, that's a consistent habit or thing that we've done in our life consistently, and
every single day.
And it's
I can't remember the last time I went a day without coffee.
So fascinating, isn't it? I always think it just blows my brain. There's a little bit to comprehend, but I just think to myself, that's something that we have just stayed consistent with for a long period of our time. But anyways, in terms of that, we're always going off on little tangents in terms of this. I just was curious. Was curious. And, for those who are listening in, it's always curious to sort of reflect and go, hold on, how long has this sort of been happening for, in terms of that?
And why? Yeah. You're like, why did I start drinking? So definitely for me, it was work related. And then I actually just started enjoying it because I remember the culture with where I worked. It was and it wasn't actually Broome, it was Denmark in Western Australia. But the culture there was you catch up with friends, and coffee was like brings people together, and they really like put a lot of effort into just a simple cup of coffee. So it was like they were very like, particular about how it was made, and like, people would be regulars at the coffee shop and they would know that their coffee was going to get made the way that they wanted it to, and all this stuff. But then I was just thinking while I was reflecting while you were chatting, and I was like, I've never actually I never started drinking coffee with normal milk. I started from day one. I was always almond milk. Never liked the taste of coffee with cow's milk. To this day, if someone puts a coffee in front of me with cow's milk, I'll have a sip and I'll be like, no. It's interesting. Just like the difference in, like, I won't drink it. Like, I'm not lactose intolerant or anything. I just won't drink it because I'm like, I don't enjoy that. It doesn't taste good to me. So I'm like, yeah.
Everyone's different, hey.
Yeah.
No, awesome. Okay. I suppose in terms of that, then, leading into sort of like our next point, we were discussing in terms of like, when you're developing a tolerance to caffeine. So, right, we're speaking in terms of our experience. We've been doing it for a while. There comes a point where it's like, like I was just saying before, like there got to a point where I was like 10, 12 coffees a day. And that was sort of tying in like how you're just speaking in terms of that coffee culture. It was like, that was my line of work. I was an account manager for cafes. So everyone's like, here, sit down, have a coffee with me. And I was like, okay.
I'm really dying on the inside. Like, that's fine. You're like shriveling up, all dehydrated.
There came a point where I had to say no. But in terms of that, we build up tolerances to caffeine in terms of what we do have, like anything, we build up a tolerance to things. And eventually, what was once something like even just speaking to before, like, starting off with like a quarter strength something, eventually I built up the tolerance in terms of that. But there is also a point where it's sort of like, how much is too much in terms of that? Yeah. And when it's important to have breaks. So, I suppose speaking in terms of this experience, Demi, for yourself, when has been an example that you could provide to the listeners in where it's sort of like you've noticed within yourself where it's like, okay, it's important for me to have a break from this to ensure that I can reset essentially?
Yeah, 100%. So the very first example that I have is in contest prep. And I always monitored my caffeine intake every day. I monitored it, like my sodium, like my water, like my fiber. The caffeine was something that I monitored too. But obviously in the later stages of contest prep, my caffeine intake was about 500 milligrams a day. That would be my upper limit, which is quite a lot. It's still not as much as 10 coffees a day though. It's like an energy drink, a double espresso shot, and another espresso shot. So I would be getting up in the morning. First thing I'd have is an espresso shot, do my cardio. Then I'd have a meal. I'd have another coffee, do my weights training like late morning to midday. And then I'd probably have another espresso shot like early afternoon because I was like poverty calories depleted, really tired, just trying to get through the afternoon of work. And I was working 12-hour shifts as well, FIFO. So, and I'd have no issues falling to sleep at like 8:30 at night. I'd get home, shower, bed straight away. It was like clockwork. But obviously coming to the end of that, it was definitely something where I was like, there's absolutely no, after comp, I was like, there's fucking no use for me to have all this caffeine anymore. So very quickly after that, I started to drop back on the caffeine consumption. And then even, like there's times where, even just earlier in the year, running your own business. And before I knew it, and working from home, before I knew it, if you're not conscious enough, you grab a third coffee for the morning, and it's like, it's not really necessary. For me, I always notice myself doing it when I'm like, I don't actually need this. It's just a habit. It's just something that I'm using as like a 5-minute break to walk away from my computer or something, like, oh, I'll just go get a coffee. And it's like, I don't need it. So they're the times when I notice that I need to take a break. And I have taken a full detox from coffee before, like completely given it up. And I will tell you, the first 2 to 3 days, I actually felt like someone hit me with a truck, to the point where I was like, if this is how my body's responding coming off coffee, I don't want to go back to drinking coffee. So I was off it for like 4 to 6 months or something. Can't remember how I started back drinking coffee, but, we can then go down the route of like, talking about how to detox. But first I'd love to hear like your experience, obviously with the job that you had with 10 coffees a day. Has there ever been Was it after that you noticed that you just didn't want to start drinking coffee again? Like, is that been ever since then?
That was nuts. I would never recommend that to anyone. That was definitely when I had massive people pleaser parts and I had to work so long, and I don't know, it was just where I was at the time. But in terms of that, it was originally started off for myself as like sort of like a cultural sort of thing, like everyone was sort of doing those sort of things, and that's just how it was, and that's how you connect in the aspect. But when it comes to, I suppose, when I've sort of noticed when it's important for me to take breaks, I suppose in the later years after that profession, something I did was definitely stop drinking coffee, because I could feel it. Like my whole life was just like on the edge all the time. Always on the edge. And it was not nice. Like, it was not nice at all, and not safe either. I'm just we'll touch on that later, how caffeine can actually have like a not positive effect. Like too much of anything is not great in terms of that. But I suppose in terms of when I sort of notice when I need to have a break from things is very similar in the ways to yourself. It's sort of like, you notice if something is like, okay, you're kind of going for it, or you're not getting what the effects are, essentially what it's for. So essentially it's supposed to help as like, for myself, I use it, for example, if I do need that little bit of extra energy throughout the day, I'm like, cool, all right, I might use that, or I might use it for a sporting performance side of things. And if I'm finding that, two's my limit, if I'm reaching like for the third, or sometimes I have done a third and I'm like, okay, I'm going for a fourth, I'm like, hold on a minute, this is coming mindless. You need to start connecting back into what I'm doing. And, sometimes I catch myself, I don't get it right. But that's when I'll notice, and I'll go, okay, cool, I need to taper back on things. Obviously, something's not agreeing with me right now. Like, honestly, you know what? One day I will not drink caffeine and it will come through. But in terms of that, that's how I sort of notice in terms of like what sort of times I need to sort of detox. And I suppose that sort of leads into like, I suppose our next points in terms of that. And I suppose for my experience in terms of how I sort of detox, I always detox, and this is something I was taught about in terms of how your body responds, but doing things gradually. So within that, with the caffeine, like if I go for like a detox and I'm like, cool, or I stop drinking it for a while and I want to let my hormones regulate in the way that it needs to, I'll do it gradually. So if I do like 2 cups of coffee a day is like my normal, I'll reduce it to like 1 cup of coffee a day for like a week or so. And then I'll gradually reduce it to like a 3/4 or a half, and then sort of gradually decrease it like that. Because I find for myself, if I change everything too quick, it sends my body into like a frenzy, and it makes me feel like I want it more. So I suppose it's sort of like I gradually just decrease it. So it's like I still get my hit in terms of that. So it's not disrupting my body too much, but it's doing it in a way that can allow my body to transition to a new baseline point. So essentially it's not so taxing, because like, even like you were just saying before, especially as we're leading into business owners, we wear a lot of hats. Like I can't be all, in terms, like I can't be feeling that way in terms of that. I can. To get shit done, I can't.
100%. It's all about trying to make sure that you're still doing things in a way that you can optimize your productivity and performance. Obviously, for a lot of reasons, people use caffeine for that exact reason, optimizing productivity and performance, and even like, mental alertness and all that sort of stuff. So if you're going to try and move away from caffeine, doing it slower for the majority is probably going to be the safer way to go. I would even say, adding to that, like trying a caffeine-free day once a week. Do you know what I mean? Just trying one day and making sure that, because I think, like you said, that sort of tracking that you've done with your system, where if you try and cut it all out at once or change things too quick, it sort of sends your body into a bit of a frenzy and you kind of feel like you want it more. I think that is something that is a bit of a safety regulation within the nervous system, where it's just like, oh my God, you've taken away something that I was kind of relying on. Is it safe? And this is what I have had chats to clients about before, where it's like, just do one day, choosing to, and we've talked about this on the podcast before, with any decision that you want to make in terms of developing a new habit, it's like, just try it for one day, and then your body will go, oh, we're all right, we're okay, we're safe. It's like, for example, I've had a very similar like conversation with a client recently about, that need for dessert after dinner. Do you know what I mean? She's like, I feel like I need it. And I'm like, it's just a habit. So after dinner, make a cup of tea and choose not to have the dessert if you're starting to feel like you're creating a negative relationship with this dessert after dinner. Like, there's nothing necessarily wrong with it, but if it's leading to binges and things like that, but taking just that one day and going, oh, I survived that. That's okay. Just one day without caffeine and see how it feels. Once you've sort of gone from two shots or 2 coffees a day down to 1 coffee a day, then just do alternate days. So one day have a coffee, next day go without a coffee, see how it feels. And you'll go, oh yeah, okay, cool. That wasn't too bad. And, if you feel like one the next day, no pressure, have one. If you don't feel like it anymore, then don't have it. That's a really like easy way to go down the route of detoxing off anything even, or like trying to choose a different behavioral pattern, because I think a large thing about coffee consumption is actually just habitual. Like you said, cultural, habitual. People wake up in the morning, first thing they reach for is a coffee, right?
Yeah. And that's important to note. And, I suppose touching on like the different methods, if it is something like you're saying, like it is something you can actually apply to anything that you do, is that the coolest thing is that you can always tweak it to suit yourself. So like, I know you were saying like do the full day sort of thing, but for myself, I found that if I cut everything out cold turkey, it's not for me. I would do things gradually for myself, but that's something that you can build within yourself and understanding yourself, how your system works, because I know that when I've done like the all or nothing sort of thing, and even if it's like one day, it's like, I don't know, there's like a part of my brain that goes, you're depriving me. And it's like,
you're missing out.
And I'm like, no, look, here you go. You get half of it. And there's like, cool. All right, here we go. And then we gradually decrease it. It's like a bartering with me brain.
I love that. That's so cute. You're like, no, here you go, brain. You get a little bit. You're not being deprived. It's like the speaking to young parts, isn't it? Where it's like,
legit.
Okay, have a little bit.
Legit. It's like that.
I love that.
Which I'm not sure. I think that works for me in terms of that, but everyone's different, right? Everyone's different. Everyone will find their own mythology when it comes to finding what works for them. But like
I said, when I did that full cold turkey detox, I felt like someone hit me with a truck. I honestly was like sitting with myself going, oh my goodness, how do I feel so shit about? And all I did was to stop drinking coffee, and I was like, oh my goodness, I didn't think it was going to be this bad. So obviously, if cold turkey is your style, prepare yourself with make sure that you don't have heaps of stuff to do, don't do it on days where you've got massive business meetings or big projects and deadlines and things like that, because you'll probably find that you'll feel a bit steamrolled, especially if you give up caffeine. You can have those withdrawals and the headaches and all that sort of stuff. So when it comes to detoxing, we went on a couple of little tangents there, but there's lots of different ways you can do it. I would say just make sure that you're finding what works for you. Again, if you're like Kirsty and you do one day of cold turkey and you're like, that's not for me, just introduce it back in slowly as well.
Yeah, exactly right. It's about finding what works for you. Yeah. And I suppose, that leads into our next point around, where can you find caffeine, right? So what, we're discussing at the start, it's like sometimes caffeine can actually be present in things that we didn't even know. And we've got some measurements here today in terms of where you can actually obtain it. And then we'll discuss as well where else you can find it too.
Yeah. And I think it's also really important to note that being really honest with your actual caffeine consumption. So for me, I drink 2 coffees a day, but they're double shots. So I'm actually having a much larger amount. Like I could say I'm just having 1 coffee, but it's like I'm always having a large and it's always got a double shot in it. So if you're having 1 espresso shot, which would just be like a small, like a regular coffee, like the small cup at a cafe, that's 60 milligrams of caffeine. And then if you're having a large, that's 2 espresso shots, so it's 120 milligrams of caffeine. If you're having I think they're like the 14 ounce or the 16 ounce, so the tall cups, that's 3 shots in those. So you're looking at 180 milligrams of caffeine in one of those big, tall cups of coffee. So if you're having 2 of those a day, was 180 milligrams. It was 180 times 2. My simple math is terrible.
It's 360.
Yeah, 360. There you go. Thank you, Kirsty. Saved me on that one. So
that's why we have 2 brains.
Yeah.
Together.
Yeah, 2 brains. So when you're having like one of those tall, say 16-ounce cups of coffee, that is equivalent to one of the 500 milligram like Monster Energies or the Mothers, because Monster Energy has 150 milligrams in one of the 500 mils. But the Mothers actually have 180. They are higher in caffeine. So you're essentially drinking the equivalent of like a Monster or a Mother. And the other things that have caffeine in them is black tea, which is actually surprisingly high in caffeine considering it's a tea. That's got 45 milligrams in one of the tea bags. And then your Coke, like Coke brands, soft drinks and stuff, Coke Zero has 35 milligrams of caffeine in it as well. So one of the things that's important to note is if you're having that sort of like sugar-free beverage or like a soda or something in the afternoon for a little bit of a, you know, I don't know, it's very common for people in fat loss phases to overuse like the Coke Zero and stuff for a bit of satiety. That's also going to pump you with a little bit of caffeine. So you just want to make sure that it's not interfering with your sleep, especially if you are someone that's sensitive to it. But again, I think it's important to just make sure that when you're consuming coffees all day, like when you're consuming multiple coffees in a day, you're actually really honest about, like with yourself, about how much caffeine that actually is. Like for me, like I said, I'm having 2 coffees a day, but they're double shot. So, because they're in like a, I think they're a 12-ounce cup or whatever you would call it, but I know that they've got 2 shots in. So that's way more coffee than if I was just to be thinking, oh, it's only 1 coffee, I'll just have another one, or I'll just have another one after that. It sends your caffeine intake pretty high pretty quickly.
That's important to note. It makes me laugh because, you know, sometimes people say I'm having 1 coffee and there's like 5 shots in there. And I'm like, oh my God, oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Which is fair enough, you know, in terms of that, you know, even in speaking in terms of caffeine consumption, you know, for myself, I'm an espresso shot sort of girl, so I'll have 1 at a time. But reflecting in terms of that though, you know, which we're going to touch on in shortly, and like how caffeine can actually be used as a beneficial aid in terms of training. But when we speak in terms of like pre-workouts and stuff, like some of the pre-workouts I used to have when I was like 18 years old in the gym was like 320 milligrams of caffeine at a time. And no wonder I never slept. Yeah. No wonder I performed really, really well sometimes, but sometimes it was too much for my system too. But, you know, speaking in terms of that, if you're having a coffee and then having pre-workout and having these things, your caffeine intake could be potentially up around like 1,000 milligrams per day. And these sort of things, there is always a limit when it comes to how much is how much is too much. And I suppose the point in terms of that, it can be used as a beneficial thing, which we'll touch in terms of the benefits shortly, but also at the same time, it's important to note that, you know, too much can like impact your sleep, can impact your heart health as well. Like it can send your body into a craze. Like, you know, people can have ill health effects. And whilst I don't like be like a Debbie Downer in that aspect, but, you know, people can have heart attacks from having too much because it sends your body into too much shock, right? Too much cortisol, too much adrenaline pumping. And it can also, I suppose, have what would you call it? Like it's like a double-edged sword where it's like, where's the point of diminishing returns? It's like when you have too much, it's like too much. Like you can't do anything. You're like almost paralyzed in a way where it's sort of like you have too much energy to be mobilized. And it's sort of like, well, that was too much. Like, what's the point? You know what I mean? But I suppose touching on the terms of like, you know, moving into like the benefits of how it can also be beneficial too. You know, we're speaking in terms of health and wellness. It can be beneficial, like you stated before, Demi, and touching on that point is that it can be used as, you know, something that helps with like cognitive sort of things. So helping you with your daily tasks and whatnot too, helps with the attention and the focus if you're feeling a little bit tired. Also be helpful in the fact that, you know, helps in terms of performance, right? So like in the gym, which is commonly what we probably associate it with in terms of that. Can be used as those sort of things as in terms of helping you increase your performance in the fact that it essentially eliminates fatigue. So it's, you know, we're speaking in terms of that caffeine. Yeah,
100%. I agree with everything there. Like there's definitely some performance benefits and some cognitive sort of alertness benefits to having caffeine. The actual coffee bean itself too does contain antioxidants, but again, you want to think about how people are actually usually consuming their coffee, and I don't necessarily think that that's actually a benefit. I think people just say, you know, oh, coffee's antioxidants, and it's like, well, I don't know if you're getting the antioxidant benefits from it, because it is an inflammatory as well. So it can increase inflammation within the body. So yeah, like I definitely think that there's reasons why you should and shouldn't consume coffee. I think if you're not someone who's training regularly, aiming for specific performance goals, has your recovery locked down really well, and has all the other nutrition considerations and lifestyle considerations locked in place, I think that if you're consuming anything over like 1 to 2 coffees a day, or say, for example, you know, people that are consuming pre-workout and then a coffee in a day and blah, 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 and they're sending their caffeine intake through the roof, I think that it's pointless. Like, you're going to get more benefit out of actually monitoring and considering all of your other variables, like your nutrition quality, your sleep quality, your recovery, your actual training volume. Like, if you've got a training program that you're pushing yourself through that you need to consume caffeine to get through, then reevaluate your actual training volume, because it may just be that there's too much and you're not actually recovering from it anyway. And the interesting thing about caffeine is, obviously we consume it to help us with our performance, right? But if we overconsume and we're not, and it's interfering with our sleep and you're not recovering properly, then those efforts that you're putting into your performance are null and void anyway, because you're not getting the benefit from them. So that's something that I would, it's sort of like a little bit of a gripe, because I see it so frequently where, and especially in the FIFO culture as well, like you see people just grabbing energy drinks and grabbing, like, shaking up their pre-workout, walking into the gym, and then you watch them train and it's like, you didn't need that pre-workout to do that session. You know, I feel like it's so overused for people that aren't necessarily putting in the effort with their performance, or they don't actually have a method to the madness when it comes to recovery and their nutrition and all that sort of stuff. So that would be my piece on that. And yeah, with pre-workouts, like you said, some of them have got like 300 milligrams of caffeine plus a chemical shitstorm of ingredients that you don't actually need, that haven't actually been that scientifically backed to help with performance anyway. So for me, it's kind of just expensive caffeine. You know, you could have a shot of coffee and experience some of the same performance benefits without messing up your digestive system, having an energy crash later in the day, and all the other sort of like side effects, like wanting to scratch your face off in the middle of your session because of the beta alanine. Like, there's lots of different things that, you know, are in pre-workouts that we kind of just don't need.
Exactly. Right. And so it always comes back to the question, you know, what are you using it for? Right.
Yeah.
And is this, like you said, impacting any of the other lifestyle factors, right? Because there's no point putting in the effort if you're not getting the rest, because that's where we do the building, right? Yeah. And all the changes in our body in terms of that, essentially, majority of it anyways. And, you know, I suppose that could be one of the key takeaways for today. It's just like, what are you using it for, right? Is it a habit, or is it something that you need, or is it something that you're depending on, right? And if you're depending on it, then it's sort of like, okay, well then how can you transition away from it for a period of time, just so that your body can actually regulate and use the hormones that it would normally do for if you had no caffeine at all, eventually, where it would naturally wake you up, take you through the sleep pressure in terms of adenosine throughout the day, and then send you to bed at a normal hour in terms of that too, and help you in terms of those sort of things. So it always comes back to those sort of things. And, you know, I suppose discussing on our last point before we do get into some tips for today, one of those is caffeine can actually affect in terms of our nutrient absorption. So depending on how much we do have throughout the day, the food, essentially, when we speak in terms of nutrition, it's an important piece for our day-to-day, right? Nutrition can provide a fuel source throughout our day in terms of energizing us, regulating us, or whatever it might be. And sometimes caffeine, so whilst caffeine has its pros, it also can have its cons in terms of how much we do have and how much it can actually interfere with absorption of nutrients.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. So definitely essential minerals like your calcium, iron, magnesium, and your B vitamins too. It does interfere with the absorption of those nutrients. So the other thing that it does do that it also is linked to the reason why it interferes with the absorption of that nutrients is it does stimulate your gut motility as well. So if you're consuming caffeine, it actually, well, I mean, I'm sure people have experienced this before where you have, a coffee in the morning and then before you know it, you're running to the bathroom to kind of like go to number twos, pass your bowels, whatever. So because of that, like if you're having caffeine and before you know it, the meal you've just eaten, you're passing that through, you're not getting the opportunity to absorb the nutrients through the digestive process. And then on top of that, it does just have sort of a leaching effect for those nutrients, because essentially when your body needs to process this caffeine, it does actually heavily require these nutrients to process and sort of remove caffeine from the body. So if you've not also looked after your nutrient consumption, i.e. getting in more of these essential minerals, more of these vitamins to counteract the amount of caffeine you're consuming, then you can end up with nutrient deficiencies. And these are nutrient deficiencies, like these are nutrients that we need for energy production and for immunity. So we're doing ourselves a disservice when it comes to like a health profile as well, if you're over consuming on caffeine.
Yeah, and that's really important to note, because a lot of the times, people do experience these deficiencies and they're like, but I'm not sure what, like a why. And, they're like, I'm eating the things, and it could be potentially in the fact that maybe it's just not being absorbed due to potentially caffeine intake. Like that's just a speculation, by the way, it's just a thought. But that's partly because, caffeine does dehydrate us as well. So essentially the essential nutrients do get stripped from our body due to its dehydrating effect. So always ensure that, if you are someone that's listening into this and you only drink caffeine or coffee or whatever it is throughout the day and no water, get your bloody water in. That's me putting my foot down. Get your water in, at least 2 liters a day. But I suppose in terms of that, it's really, really important to just, be able to take in those points around the caffeine. And something that can also impact the fact that, depending how much caffeine we do have, is that because caffeine does stimulate, quite a sympathetic response within our body, quite a lot of adrenaline in terms of that, especially depending on how much we have. Another reason why it can be really hard for us to actually absorb the nutrients that we do consume from our foods can also be because we haven't got actually back down into a rest and digest state, which is our parasympathetic state. So essentially we can't be sympathetic 24/7. There's got to be a point where we actually come down and throughout our day or whatever it might be. And that's where we bring ourselves back down into a more restful state, essentially, in terms of that, because that's when our body goes, cool, it's safe to digest, safe to absorb, do all the things in terms of that too. So it's just important to note with those things too.
Yeah, 100%. I agree.
Else you want to add?
Sorry. Oh yeah, no, I just think I was going to add, like when you mentioned about the water, so many people, first thing they do when they get up in the morning is grab a coffee without drinking any water first. And huge thing. And I used to do it. And I've noticed a massive difference in my energy levels if I have about 600 ml to a litre of water before I have a coffee. And that's another thing that we're going to cover as well in tips for caffeine consumption. So we will go through now for you, like what our main tips are around caffeine consumption, how to make the most of it, and also how to make sure it's not having like a detrimental effect on your health when you're consuming it long term. So the first one would be, my personal opinion is don't consume caffeine after like 10 or 11 a.m. But I put 12 p.m. here just because that's sort of like, most people can, it's, 12 p.m. at the latest, in my opinion. So yes, it's like the recommended rule for caffeine consumption is count back 10 hours from your bedtime, and that should be the last time you consume caffeine. So if you're going to bed at 10 p.m., 10 hours back, that's when you should have the last coffee, essentially, or any form of caffeine for the day.
Yeah, awesome. And that's really important to note with those sort of things. So it's sort of like, have a look at your caffeine habits and whereabouts you're having any sort of caffeine throughout your day. If you're having pre-workouts before you train in the afternoon, it might be, like we were saying before, reevaluate your training if you're going to need that, or potentially fuel yourself with nutrition right?
Yeah.
Rather than caffeine, because you can actually use food to your advantage. And that's something you can actually learn too. So the second point is avoid consuming caffeine on empty stomach due to the acidity factor, right? So in terms of like coffee specifically, so try to always consume it with a meal or, around a meal in terms of that aspect, because, we're speaking in terms of whilst caffeine can have, or coffee can have in particular, sometimes anti-inflammatory, it can also cause an inflammatory response in terms of the gut. And due to this acidity, that can actually cause that inflammatory response.
Yeah, 100%. And also, particularly, I'll add to that, particularly if you're a woman with menstrual cycle dysfunction, because of the relationship with your gut health and hormone regulation and menstrual cycle health. If you are putting caffeine into your body on an empty stomach, that is going to potentially be contributing to menstrual cycle dysfunction. So super, super important one. If you are like experiencing any kind of like menstrual cycle dysfunction, particularly like heavy painful bleeds, irregular periods, all that sort of stuff, have a meal with your coffee at the very least. Ideally, have a meal first, wait half an hour, then have your coffee. Give your body a chance to absorb some nutrients after a long fast. Obviously, you've been asleep for hopefully 7 to 8 hours. You may have gone 10 hours without food. The first thing you want to put in is something that your body is actually going to like utilize for producing energy and regulating your hormones and reducing the amount of cortisol within your body.
100%. And that's super important. And that will lead into, I suppose, the next point about when to have it, right? So if you are someone that is in the morning that has a coffee, right, potentially have a look at trying to push out that starting window around 60 to 90 minutes. And the reason behind that is because naturally when we wake up, cortisol levels rise. This is where adenosine starts to build the pressure as well. And we do that by, obviously receiving light from our surroundings. Now, if we disrupt that process in terms of putting caffeine in, right, we're pretty much putting a stressful response on top of cortisol, right? It's just going to dysregulate us quite a lot. And we fall out of a pattern where our body's actually unable to regulate, how much energy we kind of really do have and when to go to bed. It kind of throws us out due to the fact that we've stopped that process before it's even had a chance to essentially wake up. So something is important in terms of that, potentially, if you can, push out that window, right? 60 to 90 minutes after your first wake, and just see how you go in terms of that. Because if you're needing it as soon as you wake up in the morning, it might be like, okay, is your sleep impacted? Like what's happening there? Nutrition factors, like are you eating too much before you go to bed or not? Like are you going to bed too late? Like all those things, if you're needing it, as soon as you wake up, like that's the first thing you reach for before you even think about anything. It might be one of those things that go, okay, you know what? Maybe I just need to have a look at what's happening around this and why I feel the need to be able to, or why I feel the need to have a coffee or whatever it might be, energy, people's choice of poison, of course, at first thing in the morning before anything else.
Yep, I agree 100%. It's look at the other lifestyle variables. I would say that if you're someone that's getting up and the first thing that you need in the morning is coffee to get you going, there's something wrong. Like that's not how you're actually meant to wake up in the morning. So very, very, very good points there. My next point would be menstrual, again, a little bit touching on the menstrual cycle. If you are someone that experiences heavy, painful, like lots of abdominal cramping when you get your cycle, it is best to avoid caffeine consumption when you have your bleed or leading up to your bleed. At the very least, minimizing it, because caffeine acts as a vasoconstrictor. So what it does is it actually constricts the blood vessels. When you're having your bleed, the uterine walls, the lining of your uterine walls are shedding. So the uterus is like contracting a little bit and then relaxing and contracting and relaxing. And when you consume coffee, it actually constricts the blood vessels so that there's not enough blood flow to the uterus for it to actually effectively have that process. That can actually increase the painfulness of period cramps. So if you already experience heavy bleeds, painful periods, minimize your caffeine consumption at the very least. Best to avoid it completely. So that's something that it's in there today because I'm drinking a hot chocolate this morning because I get really painful period cramps and like to the point where I never used to listen to my body with regards to caffeine, because I also get quite fatigued. So like first thing I'm like is like, oh yes, coffee, give me a coffee, because I'm fatigued and I want to get about my day. But it actually increases the amount of pain I experience. And they've done some studies to show that those two are correlated. So that's something that is quite important. I know it sucks if no one wants to hear that, but that's the one.
It's important though, right?
Yeah.
Because what's really important in this aspect is that, essentially if you can avoid that pain, if it's unnecessary in terms of that, why not?
Yeah.
You got the option to do that. And that will come sort of things of like building that awareness or looking at things, around your menstrual cycle. It's sort of like, do I experience that? It could be other things too, but potentially that could be part of the reason, right? So it's sort of like, try it without it and just see what works in that aspect.
Yeah, 100%, definitely.
Awesome. Well, in terms of that, our last tip in terms of the caffeine consumption for this is cycling the caffeine if you do use it, right? So, we were discussing that before, but the tip to take away from today is that, take time away from it, right? Have some periods away from it. You could potentially reduce some caffeine on some days or whatever it might be, whatever feels good for you, where it's sort of like, you don't want to build up that tolerance all the time where it becomes that and it has to become, I suppose, dependency in that aspect. It's okay on the days that if you do feel energetic when you wake up in the mornings, it's like, you know what, I don't need that coffee today, and you can have that or reduce it or whatever it might be. So I suppose that's in terms of our summary for our tips for caffeine consumption today, which we're so excited to bring you that today. And we did have a couple of questions that were submitted and also from some of our listeners in as well. Yeah. So I know you had a question first from one of your followers.
Yes, I did. Okay, so someone asked me on my Instagram, essentially the link between endometriosis and caffeine consumption. So can it be a trigger for endo flare-ups? The answer in short is yes. Endometriosis is something that is very person dependent. It's very like everyone's symptoms are quite different in terms of how they experience endo. And I'm by no means an expert on endometriosis. I do have a couple of clients, or have had a couple of clients that have had endo. And it is very much like when you have endometriosis, you need to advocate for yourself in terms of understanding what causes your flare-ups and understanding how to manage them. So if caffeine has been something that you've noticed has caused a trigger, or has been, if you are consuming excessive amounts of caffeine and you're struggling with endo, then try and, trial reducing your caffeine consumption and see if that does help. But essentially, like, to my understanding, obviously the correlation between gut health and endometriosis is very strong. So when we look at caffeine consumption and its effects on gut dysbiosis, like stomach upsets and gut disease, it can increase IBS for all the reasons that we've already discussed. Yes, caffeine consumption can definitely have an increase or have an effect on endometriosis flare-ups. And again, the same thing that I've just discussed about vasoconstriction, about the cramping, and about how it increases your cramps. So yeah, there's a fair bit there that we could take some time to debunk, but it would kind of be its own whole kind of episode that we might have to get an expert on to sort of discuss. But in short, the answer is yes, it can have a link to endo flare-ups, and it is best to try and minimize or avoid caffeine if you are someone that's struggling with your endo flare-ups.
Yeah, and that's important to note. It's going to be person to person in terms of those sort of things. So always do the sort of noticing and the trial and awareness around those sort of things. But yeah. Awesome question. I feel like we should definitely do a little podcast on that.
I feel like
it'd be awesome. And the second question we had was from one of our listeners as well, was, is it necessary to have coffee to see changes in my fitness journey? So I actually got this question as well from one of my clients too. And this was, I'll put a little backstory to it and then we'll answer in terms of that. But the backstory is that she previously worked with a coach, and the coach had said to her that if she wants to get results, she has to have caffeine, and which is an interesting statement. I personally have I'll never agree with that. Personally, if you're not having caffeine, you don't need it. But in terms of this, that was recommended to her from her coach. And now she's like, very high up in the caffeine sort of throughout the day, which is affecting her sleep and ripple effect and all those sort of things. But all in all, right, it's it's not necessary to get results when it comes to seeing changes in your journey, right? We always got to think about things is that caffeine is essentially like a supplement to your lifestyle, right? It's essentially a supplement in the fact that it is supplementing in terms of helping you just become a little bit more focused or energized, essentially blocking you from being tired, right? Too much of that can also be detrimental, but it's not necessary in terms of the fact that you need it to get results, right? Do all the other things, focus on the lifestyle factors, like in terms of good movement, nourishment, rest, right? Training with good periodization, whatever it might be that your goals are.
Yeah.
It's like, it's not necessary. It's not necessary.
Yeah.
So if anyone ever says that you need caffeine to get results, tell them that you heard it here first on Creating Connection, that you don't need it.
Run away from them. Don't walk, run.
Use your energy, girl. It's in there.
Yeah. Sip on your espresso and run the fuck out. No, just kidding. Yeah, that's really interesting to me that she was told that by a coach. It just goes to show that there are still people out there that are, you know, not giving out the best information, which is, it's quite sad. And the worst thing about this is that now your client is experiencing something that she believed to be beneficial for her and is actually detrimental to her goals and her results and her sort of like quality of life, essentially. Because if you think about it, if someone said to you, you know, it's essential for you to have caffeine for you to be able to, I mean, it's a frustrating thing to hear, because how about help that person with maybe the reason why they're not getting the results that you expected that they were going to get as their coach? Look at some other variables and go, okay, maybe why is her energy shit so she can't put effort into a training session? Oh, because she's got all these other stresses and lots of other lifestyle variables going on for her right now. So what other variables can I change in her training program that's going to help her out a little bit? Rather than just like, here's a Band-Aid fix, go and have some coffee, you'll be right. You need this, blah, blah, blah. But for whatever reason, at least we have this platform now to be able to say, you definitely don't need caffeine to get results. Ideally, like, it's my opinion that if you can get amazing results without needing to use any other ergogenic aid, fucking go for it. Use your body for what it's made for. Like you said before, Kirsty, there'll be a time where you don't consume caffeine at all. And I'll be the same. Eventually I'll get there where I'm just like, you know what? I'm not attached to this in any way, shape, or form anymore. And I like my body functioning like on its own, you know, on its own merit. Like, these are supplements to our lifestyle. They're meant to enhance your lifestyle. And the moment that they stop enhancing your life, then that's when you need to reassess and reevaluate whether you need it.
100%. 100%. It's like anything we do. But awesome. But yes, very interesting point. If someone tells you you need to do something in terms of that, always question it. Get sources, get two opinions. But yeah, you definitely don't need that. No. All right, awesome. I suppose we've got some little fun facts in terms of, we thought we'd finish off the episode with a bit of a laugh, because we do like to do it that way. Just some fun facts about coffee. So, Demi, what was your fun fact for today to share with the listeners?
My fun fact was that coffee grind is actually very good compost. So because of its high nitrogen content, it's actually really, really, really good to add into a compost. So cafe I used to work at, we had a garden out the back of the cafe, and we used to put all the coffee grind into a big compost bin that was dug into the ground. And yeah, so if you mix it, it's too strong for you to just put it straight onto your plants, which actually just reminds me that I saw Aaron doing that to my plants the other day. Oh my God. I've just literally, as I'm talking about it, it's just fucking dawned on me that Aaron was asking me a question about coffee, like what I was doing with the coffee ground. I was like, it's really good compost, I'm just saving it. And he's like, oh, so I can put it on the plants. And I was like, yeah. And then I saw him, and it wasn't until just doing the research for this podcast that I've learned, obviously, it's too strong to put on your plants. So if my plants die in the next week, I'm going to be very upset. But what you should actually do is you should mix it with like other manures, and, you know, like if you have food scraps and stuff like that added into that, and it actually generates some really nutrient dense fuel for your gardens. Just don't stick it on straight I'm pretty sure he was going around to the plants being like, you have some coffee, you have some coffee, everybody gets some coffee. I'm pretty sure that's my memory of what happened there, but that's funny. I'm going to have to go sort out my plants now.
You'll have to go check them out. You have to keep us updated in terms of how the plants are going throughout the next episodes, if they're thriving or just surviving.
Yeah. Anyway, you've got a really good fun fact. I want to hear it.
It was so random, this one. Coffee was discovered by a goat herder. So it was all the way back in the 1500s. It was said that a goat herder in Ethiopia discovered coffee after observing strange behavior in his goats, which cracks me up, right? Because it's like, you know, just makes me laugh. He noticed that after they ate the coffee cherries, so off the plant, they suddenly had lots of energy and were unable to sleep at night. He shared his findings with the local monks who made their own drinks from the coffee beans, and the rest, they say, is history.
Wow, that is really cool.
It's random, that. So cool. Let's say like that's honestly how they would have had to do it back then. It's like in terms of that. And I suppose we do that now. We're always experimenting in some sort of way, but it's like, oh, what's this? Like, oh, I don't like that. Oh, I like that. Yeah. So it's essentially what they did. And they're like, everyone needs this.
Yeah. Well, even in Bali, when we went there just before, and I've done this before, like in Vietnam and stuff, they have like your cat poo coffee. They're not cats, but I'm pretty sure they just call it cat poo coffee because it's easy for the tourists to comprehend. But basically, they're more like possums, but basically they eat the coffee bean, it goes through their digestive tract, and then they poop it out. And I can't remember what happens when you go to these places that serve this coffee. They explain the process of like the nutrients that it adds to the actual coffee bean. But when it comes out in their feces, they then harvest that as a coffee bean, as coffee grind. So it comes out in the shell still. So then they break away the shell, and what's left underneath is like the coffee bean, and then they grind that up. But yeah, they basically make coffee out of coffee beans that have been eaten by an animal, pooped back out, and then harvested.
I'm not gonna put that on my bucket list.
Yeah, it's fine. It tastes fine. You see the whole process when you go there. But it's really interesting. I'm just like, what made me wonder, I was like, who the hell discovered it first? And was like, this possum-like animal has ingested these coffee beans and pooped them out. I think I'm going to try it. Like, who actually thought to do that first is what I want to know. But yeah, that wraps up our episode on caffeine, guys.
Well, we hope
long finish.
Oh, honestly, we hope, yeah, solid finish. I love it. It's killing me. Oh my God. Thanks so much for listening into our episode today of Creating Connection in Health and Wellness with the beautiful Demi and myself, Kirsty. If you like this episode or loving our podcast, please leave us a review or take a screenshot of this episode and share it to your socials and give us a tag. So we'll leave our Instagram handles in the description below. Every reshare counts, and we deeply appreciate it, in terms of this, because it, gets our podcast out, blessing the ears of so many more as you reshare to the world. And, we're really excited for that in that aspect too.
Yeah. Thanks for listening, everyone. Have a beautiful day.
See you guys.